that I've prepped the mix, I can begin the mix process. My mix process is a little different for each project, but typically I like to follow the same workflow and then adjust according to the project itself, because the mixing process is very personal to each project and each engineer. So it's really nice to be able to fluctuate and try new things, but it's nice to rely on some old tricks and techniques learned over the years. First thing I'm going to do is do a file save as. Right now I'm in the mix prep session for Pro Tools. So I'll go File, Save As. We'll call this one Mix 1 for the video. And what I'll do is after I do a mix, after I do a passive mix, I'll export it from Pro Tools, check it in my car, check it in my home stereo setup, and then I can come back to Pro Tools, make a duplicate of this session, call it Mix 2, and then begin to mix from there. That way I can always go back to Mix 1 if there's something I liked from Mix 1. You'll also notice that all of my subgroups are at 0. No positive changes, no negative changes. So then what I'll do is I'll start to change the volumes of my tracks and then eventually do some bus processing on all of these subgroups, of course, only if they need it. When I start a mix, I like to think about what are the core elements of the song. In this particular song, I'm feeling like the kick, the snare, the bass, and the vocal are pretty darn integral to the entire song. So I'm going to start with those. And while I like to stay in the mix window as much as possible for the mixing process, sometimes you do need to switch back and forth between the mix window and the edit window. I like to do that as little as possible. And there's a couple little ways we can do that. Let's switch over. I did Command tilde. That way I didn't have to move my hand all the way over to Command equals if I want to switch over to the mix window with that traditional quick key, but Command tilde works the same. You'll notice I have all of these markers. If I hit Command 5 on the numpad, it brings up my memory locations window. You can also access that from Window and then Memory Locations. You'll see that each of my memory locations has a number associated with it. The intro is number 1, verse 1 is number 2, and so on and so forth. There's a fun quick key. I can just hit period and then the number 2 and then period again, and it will go to that memory location, which is really convenient if I'm in this window. If I wanted to say loop the first verse, I can have the verse 1 memory location selected, hold shift, and then do period 3 period to make a selection between verse 1 and the chorus. Now I have a whole selection there, and as long as I'm in loop playback mode, it'll always loop. I can right click and change it to be in loop or not in loop. So I have a nice loop already selected. Perhaps I want to have a little bit of pre-roll into the verse 1. For example, let's say I want to go to verse 1 and listen to it, period 2 period. If I just hit play, it goes right to the verse. However, if I put pre-roll on, which is also just Command K to turn it on and off, currently I have it set for a 2-bar pre-roll. That means it's going to go back 2 bars before where my playhead is. So if I hit play right now, you'll see it jump back 2 bars. That way I can hear the song as it goes into the section as opposed to hearing it go directly to that one section. And this allows me to stay in the mix window as much as possible. And this just helps me out. It's a personal thing. I don't like looking at waveforms as much when I'm mixing. I begin to use my eyes too much as opposed to using my ears. I'm going to begin by balancing the kick, the snare, the vocals, and the guitars just to see where that gets me. And then after I bring up those core elements, I'll begin to introduce all the other instruments to fill in the space. Let's make sure we have that loop before we get started. So that was period 2 period to go to the first verse, shift, period 3 period to go to the chorus, but it just made the selection there. Now when I hit play, it'll just loop. And of course, when I hit stop, it's going to just continue to keep the loop selected so that I can just hit stop, make changes, and then hit play again, and it'll play the loop again. And that's because I have this button unchecked. That's the insertion follows playback. If I have that selected, if I hit play and then stop, it'll put my playhead right where I stopped. And I don't want that. I don't have to keep on redoing my selection. So I'm going to make sure that's off. Okay, so now that I have my selection, I'm going to move back to the mix window. And if I hit play, you'll notice that I get meters. We're not hearing anything because all the tracks are turned down, but the subgroups are up, so we're not sending any volume to our subgroups right now. And the reason I can see all these meters is because they're in pre-fader. Under options, that's the pre-fader metering button right here. If you have pre-fader metering on it will display the waveform before it gets to the fader itself. So the fader itself has no bearing on the or on the metering. This is a nice way just to see what we have playing when our volumes are all the way down. So now I can start to begin to turn some instruments up. I have a control surface, so you'll see them turn up without my mouse.
Surely into sight, it said, come and waste your time, and it all turns out fine. Yeah, it said, slow moving train, it was.
One thing I know about myself is I tend to mix the kick and snare a little too loud, so I like to get it where I think it sounds good and then turn it down just a little bit and then kind of feel or reevaluate from there. And typically I'm like, oh, okay, cool, I still like that. And it kind of helps safeguard me against myself. So then after I balance the core elements, and clearly I'm moving pretty quickly through this, doing the actual mix would be a very long video, so I'm just kind of doing the overview, but I'll start to fill in the space. If I have time, I like to just start the song from the very beginning and mix it as I go. Sometimes I don't have too much time for that. I just need to get a quick balance of the volumes. If that's the case, there's a fun little trick I can do. I can actually just start it straight from the beginning if I want. So period, 1 period, hit play. And as I see the meters, I can begin to turn those instruments up. Sometimes you want to turn up certain sections, but you just don't know where they're at in the timeline. So you're going to have to switch back to the window or to the edit window, unless, of course, you have it memorized of where those come in. I know these come in during the first verse and during the first chorus and the second chorus. But here's a fun little trick I can do. I can just click on them and see how they're highlighted. If I move to the edit window, they're still highlighted on this side. So then I can just click, oh, right there, hit play, move to the next, or move back to the edit or the mix window, and then I can turn these up as they come in.
All turns out fine, yeah, it said, come waste your time, and it all turns out fine, it said, just rest your feet and bask in my sweet retreat, yeah, it said.
A good rule of thumb is never to turn up any settings or any volumes or make any changes unless you're hearing the change as it's occurring. It's just a good practice to do it that way. The other thing I'm doing is I'm actually able to manipulate all 4 of these at once because I'm using my control surface. The way I was able to quickly navigate there is you hold control and shift, and whatever track you select, it puts that directly to the left of your mix window, but it also makes it be the very first fader on your control surface. So it makes it really easy to navigate. You just click where you want, control and shift click it, and then I can begin manipulating volumes. So I'll just go ahead and start with a nice balance of the song, and we'll start with the intro.
Your head, so I did just what it said. Turning corners in the night, moving surely into sight. It said, come and waste your time, and it all turns out fine. Yeah, it said, come waste your time, and it all turns out fine. It said, just rest your feet and bask in my sweet retreat, yeah, it said. this order I hear. Just rest your head, so I did just what it said. My soul's a little heavy here now, but I feel no fear, 'cause I feel my burdens lifting slow, said. My soul's a little heavy here now, but I feel no fear, 'cause I feel my burdens lifting slowly off my shoulders here. And it said, come waste your time, and it all turns out fine. It said, just rest your feet and bask in my sweet retreat. Yeah, it said, come waste your time, and it all turns out fine. It said, just rest your feet and bask in my sweet retreat. Yeah, it said.
So at this point, I have all of my volumes up, generally placed where I like them. These actually can be deleted, so let's go ahead and get rid of those. And then now that I have a full balance of the song, or at least, for the video, it's just nice and quick. But now that I have a full balance of the song, I can begin to evaluate where I want EQ, compression, and the direction I want to head. By having a full balance already with all my volumes of every track up, I know what I'm dealing with, and I can make educated decisions as opposed to just working isolated with just the kick, just the snare. I like to try to avoid being in solo as much as possible, because if I, for example, make the kick just sound great by itself and then I unsolo it, it probably is not going to fit with the song. It needs to be balanced with the song in regards to its frequencies and its volumes, and its overall character. So I like to try to make sure that I don't do any of those changes in solo. Of course, we use solo sometimes to figure out a problem, or just generally just to hear what it is. But instead of turning or putting the kick in solo and working with that, sometimes I like to just turn it up, and then I can start to EQ and compress it. But for the most part, I like to do that with all my my tracks engaged at the same time and not in solo. Before I do that, I might end up putting in some more spatial effects that are more integral to the song. For example, this guitar right here. Here's a fun trick I like to do. I have it pan to the left. Let's go to that section for where that is. So I know it's selected, so I just have to find it on the left. Here it is. And that's right at the instrumental. So I just can click right on the instrumental, and I'll get some pre-roll into it because I have my pre-roll on. And I'm going to activate this delay guitar, or this bus, to my delay guitar track. Now I'll activate the send that I created during the mix prep. That's going to the delay guitar bus. And notice how I have my guitar panned to the left. What if I were to pan this to the right? So the send is going to the right. My actual guitar is going to the left. And then on my guitar delay, I've got it set to have like an 87 millisecond, or just a really short delay time with very little feedback and a little bit of high and low cut. Of course, it's 100% wet in the mix. Let's go ahead and just solo that and hear what this sounds like now that I have the delay in the right, but then the source track in the left. Kind of gives it a little bit more space and kind of a little bit less mono, kind of fits in the mix a little bit more. So let's go ahead and hear this in context. I'll go ahead and bypass the send every once in a while so we can hear what it sounds without it.
My sweet retreat, yeah, it said.
just adds a little bit of space to it in a very pleasing way. I like to do that with any guitars that I've recorded in mono, just so that the if I'm panning hard left or panning hard right, I still get a little bit of information on the other side, almost as if I'm doing a stereo recording and I have one microphone perhaps in the hallway and then one microphone directly on the cab itself. I kind of give a little bit more space that way. I'll also engage perhaps the reverb and delay for my vocal just to help see where that fits in the mix as well. So Command Control to click on these sends to reactivate them. And they're probably, yep, they're all at unity. So it's going to be quite loud. Let's just go ahead and see what it sounds like this, and we can make our adjustments.
Slow-moving train, it was calling my name. It said, just rest your head. So I did just what it said. Turning corners in the night, moving surely into sight.
Yeah, I like it just subtle like that. I kind of want the vocal to be a little bit more dry. So now I've already done a couple passes of the mix, checked it in the car, checked it on my home stereo, checked it on my AirPods, all my typical listening environments, made some notes for myself and adjusted accordingly. And during those times, I'm always doing file save as I go. So I'm already on mix 3. It's really nice to find your own way of organizing your sessions, just for whatever works for you. And if you're working with other people, it's really nice to communicate with them so that you can all be on the same page. And during the process of checking in my car and checking my headphones and such, and during this whole process, I essentially found there's a gap in my mix. I'm losing energy on certain sections of the song where I felt like there needed to be a little bit more energy. And I thought that this might be able to be addressed in the mix, just because I thought it was going to be subtle enough. But during the mixing process, I was wrong. I needed another instrument to fill that space, so I chose an electric guitar. And I recorded the electric guitar, but of course, all of these plugins are increasing the latency of the Pro Tools session, especially this bass track right here. So all I did, you can see it's frozen. It's not delayed at all. So all I had to do is right click and then say freeze. If I unfreeze this, then all those plugins can be editable again, because if I click on them, I can't change any of them. I've essentially written a very temporary audio file for this bass track with these settings. I can still change the volume, but I can't change any of the plugins. But then this way, Pro Tools doesn't render those, and then I don't have as much latency in my system. But I added the electric guitar in there, and I felt like it really helped increase the energy during some of the instrumentals. Another thing I noticed about the mix is that my kick just wasn't sustaining very long, and I was losing power in the kick. It didn't feel quite right. So I used a little trick I learned a long time ago. I don't typically use it, but for this case, in this case, it worked out quite well. Here's my kick, and I did a send to bus 2. It's a pre-fader send, so that means that any volume changes from the actual fader won't affect the volume going out bus 2. I then made a new audio or aux track mono, and I let its input be bus 2. So now bus 2 is feeding to this track. And then I inserted an EQ on there, and I kind of bumped it up around some frequencies I wanted to resonate, cutting out the highs. That's really important here, so that it kind of would resonate during those in those frequency ranges. And then on the aux track, I also send out a pre-fader send to bus 2. So that means it's feeding back on itself. And if I turn the volume down of the send, I can control the amount that it feeds back. And this way I get a nice, thick, more sustained kick. So let's go ahead and hear what it sounds like. I'm going to mute that kick feedback track, and then I'm going to solo the drums so that all the other tracks are muted. Now we're just going to hear just the kit, and then I'll mute and unmute the kick feedback track every once in a while. It's subtle, but it really helps out in the full mix. Another thing I noticed that was happening is that my bass and my kick were really blending together a little bit too much. This is very typical for this genre of music, or rock and roll, or essentially anything with an acoustic bass or an electric bass and an acoustic drum kit. So to combat this, I did some sidechain compression. I'm going to go ahead and unfreeze that track now so I can edit it. And you'll see from the kick, I did another send out. That was from bus 3, and it's a pre-fader send. So again, any volume changes to the track itself won't affect the send volume. And then I inserted a compressor. This works with essentially any compressor. I like using the FabFilter compressor. I inserted a compressor on there. I changed my key input to be bus 3, so it's receiving the information from the kick. And then I made sure to go to my sidechain tab and make sure that it's paying attention to the external key, not the internal key. So by paying attention to the external key, then this bass right here is going to not trigger the compressor. Rather, the key is going to trigger the compressor. So even though it's on the bass track, it's going to compress the bass as if it were the kick drum. So that means each time the kick drum occurs, it's going to turn down the bass just a little bit. And if I tune my attack and my release, especially if I'm using a pretty gentle ratio, 2-to-1 is a great place to start with. It'll turn down the kick or turn down the bass whenever the kick occurs. Let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. And you can visually see how it's dipping the bass a little bit. And that way I get a little bit more of the attack of the kick drum to shine through before the bass comes in and kind of overwhelms that frequency range. It's kind of a good way to get the best of both worlds. And in the mix, it sounds pretty good.
Slow moving train, it was calling my name. It said, just rest your head.
Another thing I noticed in the mix is that my guitars were overwhelming the vocal. I'm singing a little bit softer, and my guitars were just kind of overpowering the vocal in those places where they overlap in their frequency. So I did essentially the same thing that I did to the kick and the bass. I did a send out from my lead vocal out to, say, bus 1, and then I put a compressor on the acoustic guitar subgroup, made its key input be bus 1, set it to pay attention to an external key, bus 1, and it will compress all of my acoustic guitars whenever my lead vocal is singing. And I'm doing it very subtly. I'm doing it just to like a 2-to-1 ratio, and the threshold is not quite up there, but you can, let's go ahead and check out what it sounds like. You can hear it and you can see it.
Slow moving train, it was calling my name. It said, just rest your head, so I did.
And I gave it a little bit of a longer release so it sounded a little bit more natural, but it really did free up a lot of space in the mix by just automatically turning those acoustic guitars down just a little bit whenever the lead vocal is singing. Kind of helps them pump a little bit to the music as well. I also noticed that that electric guitar part was kind of getting in the way a little bit, so I did some automation for that. Right here we can see I have automation. I'm in the volume viewpoint for that lane, so if I hit minus, it'll go back to the waveform clip view. If I hit minus again, it goes back to the volume waveform view, or I can just click on and choose whichever setting I want. I really don't like clicking on here and then changing it to the lane that I want for automation. So one thing you can do is if you hold Command and Control and you click on any parameter that has automation or has an automation lane, it'll display that. So right now, see my pan is to the left. If I hold Command and Control and click on it, see how it's changed my automation lane to view the pan. So I don't have to navigate to that. I can just Command, Control, click on it. Now I see the volume, hit minus again just to go back to my waveform view. Let's go ahead and just do another pass of automation just to demonstrate it. So I'll go ahead and delete this. I'm going to put this into touch mode. In touch mode, no matter what I do, if I'm just going to turn that fader up, as long as I'm touching it, it'll stay at that location when I'm automating. But then when I let go, it snaps back down to its original volume. So let's go ahead and automate this. And of course, let's do it in the mix or in the context of the entire song, because isn't that the point? To balance the volumes for the song itself, not to do everything in isolation.
Rest your feet and bask in my sweet red tree. Yeah, it said.
There's a moment right here where I actually want to turn it down, so let's punch that in. That worked out nicely. I can go ahead in there and clean it up if I want to by holding, if I'm on my grabber tool, Option and clicking on anything will delete or get rid of those nodes. So now I'll continue to mix, and I anticipate a couple things that will need to happen. If my reverb's getting in the way, I might end up putting a compressor on the reverb and sidechaining it to the vocal so that it dips in volume until the vocal is done singing, and then the reverb can ring out a little bit more at that point. We'll do that if we really need it, but I'm not too sure if we'll end up needing that. But so far, the song Slow is coming along nicely. I'll probably give this a little more space. I don't want to keep on listening to it. I don't want to keep on listening to it and keep on editing and going down a rabbit hole. I would rather just give some space, give my ears a break, and come back and listen to it with fresh ears. So whenever I mix, I like to make sure that I have a time frame that allows me to put space between my mixes. That way I can perhaps think about it throughout the day, listen to another song and realize, oh, that's something I'd like to do. That would work perfectly in the song I'm mixing right now. But for me personally, time is the big factor here. If I put time in between my mixes tend to sound a lot better. Not to say I can't just run and gun and mix something really quickly. It's just not my strength. So of course I'm working with what I'm good at in this moment. In the song Summer Rose, I have an interesting situation with the snare. I used Addictive Drummer for the drums for this EP, and I'm really happy with how it sounds. I used a malleted kit for this song. However, halfway through the song, the snare drum switches from a malleted drumstick to a regular drumstick, and then also the snare is engaged. For the first portion of the song, the snare is not engaged on the drum or on the snare drum, so it doesn't have that nice thwack that we typically hear in a snare. Rather, it's a very nice round sound that I really think fits with the beginning of the song. However, when we get to the third instrumental where the energy rises, I do want that snappy, typical snare, so that's why it's been engaged halfway through the song. Let's go ahead and just take a listen to it. I'll go ahead and go to my VCA and solo the drums. Now we can hear the drums by themselves. So there's the sound of the drum kit, or there's the sound of the drums. So there's the sound of the snare without the snare engaged and using a malleted. So there's the sound of the snare with a malleted drumstick without the snare engaged. Let's go to the second portion of the song and listen to the snare here. You can hear the snare drum now has the snare engaged, and it's a lot more appropriate for the end of the song where I have the energy rising. However, you'll also notice that it is overly compressed during this moment when the snare drum is engaged, but here it's not. It's a lot lighter. We can actually go in solo while our VCA is in solo. Now we're soloing just the snare drum. We're getting very little gain reduction there compared to here. It's just too much in that moment. So what I need to do is I need to make sure that my compressor reacts to the snare drum here differently than it reacts here. Perhaps I also want to do this with my EQs or any other plugins I'm using. Before I do anything, I want to make sure I have a couple settings on. If I go to my settings in Pro Tools under mixing, there's a and then underneath the automation portion, there's a plugin controls default to auto enabled button. As long as this button is clicked, anytime you create a new plugin, it'll automatically make sure every single plugin parameter is automation enabled. I can confirm that by clicking on waveform of the track, and I can see that everything is automation enabled. If I didn't do that, if I didn't have that setting on, then what I could do instead is I could just click on this portion right here of my plugin and make sure that all of the settings that are on the left-hand side get moved over to the right-hand side by selecting them and hitting the add button. But they're already there, so I'll leave it. The other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that Pro Tools has automation enabled for certain parameters. So I'm going to hit Command 4 on the numpad, and that brings up the automation window. Otherwise, I can go Window and then Automation. And you can see here that nothing has been enabled. So let's go ahead and test that out or demonstrate that. I'll go into touch mode with my snare, and if I click on this little fader right there, it pops the fader out for this track, so I can manipulate from here a little bit easier. But let's also switch to our volume, and let's check it out. Let's switch to our volume to see the volume automation line, and I can click on waveform and then go down to volume, or I can also just hold Command and Control and click on whatever parameter, and it automatically gives me that automation lane. But since volume is not engaged for automation right now, if I am, and I'm in touch mode, so I can automate, if I hit play, it didn't write any automation there. But if I turn it on, then it writes the automation. So I want to make sure that all of this is on. So I'll go ahead and hold Option and click on that to make sure all of them are engaged. I don't really need this right now, so that's okay. I can actually, now I'll go ahead and move this over here, get it out of the way. Now I can get started addressing each section differently. So I have all these plugins over here, and all these plugins are dialed in according to the malleted drum kit sound or the malleted drum snare sound. So I have all these plugins over here, and they're all set to go along with the recording of the malleted drum kit or the malleted snare without the snare engaged. So then what I'm going to do is I've highlighted that section, and I'm going to write all of the automation, all the settings that I have right here. I'm going to write them all as automation into this section. So then I hold Command, Option, /. When I did that, that just wrote in all the settings as automation. You can see it even created a little automation point. That means that I can now, that means that all of this is saved, and I can go over here and start addressing my different settings. So if I hit play, you can, it's very clearly way too overly compressed. So I can go ahead and back off the threshold a little bit like this. But of course, when I hit play, it snaps those settings back to where they were because now there's automation. So it's paying attention to those automation points. To get around this, I'm going to go into preview mode. In preview mode, it's not going to snap these to their automation values. I can just listen to it. And I can test it out and makes changes to the settings without it snapping to its original automation point. Now let's just say, because we're moving quickly for the video, let's just say that this is the setting that I like. After I've made my changes, I'm in preview mode. I'm going to go ahead and write these to the selection that I have. Command, Option, /. We can confirm that. I'm going to hold Command and Control and click on the input right here. So it gives me the view of the input gain for the automation lane. And you can see that it's set at this level here and then set at this level here. Now I'll get out of preview and listen or watch and listen as it changes during this moment right there. So clearly I need to fine tune that. But this is just a good demonstration of how we can address certain portions of the track with automation with our plugins, rather than having to say, take this section and put it on its own separate track. This is just a really nice, easy, convenient way to do it all in one track.